Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over the final chapter of part 1, which is chapter 8. Alright, let's see what's going on with the dark-headed woman, the Ministry of Truth, and other things that are starting to progress. Shall we? This chapter starts out with Winston walking down the street and all of a sudden smelling roasting coffee. Not victory coffee, but real coffee. He thought for a second that he might have been in his childhood world, but then all of a sudden a door banged and the smell was cut off from him. He tells the reader that after work that day, when he walks out in the April day, it seems really nice, and not like the days he's previously known. He also goes to state that members of the party were not necessarily supposed to have free time. The party does not like it when people spend time alone or in solitude, and in fact, Winston says there's a word for this in Newspeak, and it's called own life. When they were not working or sleeping, they were then to be in communal spaces with other people of the party and playing games and socializing, etc., etc. However, as he was walking during this April day out of work, he thought of how awful it was to be in the communal spaces, and the last thing he wanted to do was to go to them. He decides to walk in the opposite direction of his normal path and starts to walk towards London southeast, all over, getting lost in the streets. He says as he's walking around, he notices all of the slums and the buildings and the broken windows, and mentions all of the people he sees and how gross and disgusting the proles look. He also says that though it's not illegal to take a different way home than what you're usually supposed to, it wasn't out of the ordinary for a member of the party to stop you and ask you questions as to why you were in certain areas. Suddenly, as he's walking down the street, a large commotion starts to happen and people start to dart into doorways, grabbing children and everything they can. One of the proles then yells, "Steamer, look out." Winston knew that steamer was a nickname for a rocket bomb, so he throws himself onto the ground, and seconds later he can feel objects hitting his back. When he stands up, he realizes that he was covered in fragments of glass from the nearest window. He then realizes the bomb had demolished a group of houses 200 meters up the street from where he was at, and smoke was billowing into the sky above. He then notices a large crowd starting to form around the building, and he goes up to it himself. As he's going up to see for himself, a severed hand is on the ground, and immediately he kicks it into the gutter to avoid the crowd, and then he turns down the street. Winston continues walking and notes that it's around the 20th hour, and a lot of local bars that the proles frequent, called pubs, were in high use. He also mentions how they smell really bad, like urine and sawdust and beer all mixed together, and that as he was walking he saw 3 men on the street huddled up reading a newspaper. As he passed by them, he could tell they were all concentrating and must be reading something pretty serious. As he's walking past them, they all begin to talk about numbers and their importance, and what is lucky and what is not lucky. Winston realizes these men are talking about the lottery. He notes how the proles are very obsessed with the lottery and how a lot of them cling to it as a form of lifeline and reason to still be alive. Winston notes the party never really paid out any large sums, and that no big winners were ever really announced. It was more of a way for the party to make money from the proles, and occasionally they would pay out small sums to the winners. As Winston is walking down the street, he realizes that he is in a very familiar place. He mentions how in this part of town, this is where he bought the diary, his pen, and the bottle of ink. As he's walking down the street, he looks over across and sees an old man of about 80 walking into a prole pub. Before he can even let fear take in, he crosses the street and goes inside the pub. He wants to talk to the man about what life was like when he was a child and how society was before the party. He steps into the bar and immediately the terrible smell hits him. As he looks around the room, he sees the old man up at the bar arguing with the bartender. The whole altercation is because the old man wants a pint of beer, but the bartender says they don't have pint. They have liters and half liters. The bartender also says he doesn't even know what a pint is, to which the old man explains that a pint is half of a quart and 4 quarts makes a gallon. The old man says, "Do I need to teach you your ABCs?" When Winston steps into the bar, everything stops for like 30 seconds, and all the proles look at him. But after this time, everything goes back to normal. Winston walks up to the old man and says, "Here, let me buy you a drink." The old man says thank you, and they make their way to a table under one of the windows. And luckily, there's not a telescreen in this establishment. With 2 half-liter glasses in hand, they begin to talk. Winston says the old man must have seen great changes since he was a young man. The old man says the beer was better and that it was cheaper. He said of course that was before the war. Winston asks which war was that, and he said all the wars. The old man then wishes the best of health to Winston, and he knocks back the beer as fast as he can. Winston goes to the bar and comes back with 2 more half-liters and begins to talk to the old man again. Winston tries desperately to talk to the old man and see if the old man can answer some of his questions. Winston asks the old man if he remembers what life really was like before the party. The old man essentially talks about a bunch of nonsense or details that don't really matter. The first thing the old man talks about are top hats and how the last time he wore one was about 50 years prior at his sister's funeral. He then talks about the lackeys. Winston asks him if it was true that capitalists really ran everything and that the common people had to tip their hats whenever they saw them. The old man says yes, and then he remembers tipping his hat to them on occasion. Finally, Winston tries to get something from this old man. Winston asks him would he rather live in a time before the party or now. The old man finishes the last of his glass of beer and states that a lot of people would say that they would prefer to live when they were younger, due to the fact they had their strength and their health, and now that he's an old man, he has many problems that he has to deal with. All in all, the old man says that Winston should be appreciative of his youth and at the age he currently is at. After Winston realizes he's not going to get much more out of this old man, the old man gets up and goes to the restroom, and Winston leaves and goes back outside onto the streets. As he's walking down the streets, in thought, he comes across the exact shop he bought the diary from. Before Winston even realizes it, his feet take him inside the shop, and the shop owner greets him. Winston then immediately thinks of an excuse of why he's in there, and in case someone from the party happens to walk in, and he would tell them that he was buying razor blades. The shop owner remembers Winston and says, "Oh, I know you, you're the one who bought the diary." The shop owner asks if he's looking for anything in particular, and Winston says no, he's just looking around. As Winston is looking around, something tends to catch his eye. He moves over to one of the tables and he sees a small piece of glass that's curved at one end and flat on the other, and inside is a beautiful pink type of material. He asks the shopkeeper, "What is it?" And the shopkeeper tells him it's a piece of coral from the Indian Ocean. It looks like that because it's been embedded in resin. The shop owner says it's such a beautiful piece, but antiques really nowadays don't mean much. Winston makes out that this must have been some sort of paperweight. Winston thinks how beautiful this piece is and asks the shop owner how much is it, and the shop owner says it's $4. Winston hands over the money and puts the piece into his pocket. He is grateful that though the piece is very heavy, it doesn't make a large bulge inside of his pocket. That way he can hide it and disguise it. Winston also lets the reader know that members of the party are not supposed to have pretty things or things made from a previous age. After Winston buys this, the shop owner says there's another room upstairs if he's interested in looking. However, the shop owner would need to assist him in bringing light into the room. The old man winced, and they made their way up the stairs, and Winston can see the room in full view. He mentions how the room looks very inviting and comfortable, with a mahogany bed, a bookcase, a table, and a fireplace. He begins to think of how cozy this place might be, even though it's still pretty dingy. The notion even comes across Winston's head of renting this place from the prole, but quickly the notion's forgot about. The old man tells Winston that him and his wife lived here, but ever since she's passed away, he's been selling off all the furniture little by little because he can't think of living in it without her. He even mentions that the bed is very comfortable, minus the bugs that, it has. But it might be pretty cumbersome to try to move this piece somewhere else. Winston makes his way around the room and looks at everything that there is, from the bed to the bookcase to the mirror and everything in between. He then comes across a picture that's hanging on one of the walls. In this picture, he can see a building in it, and it catches his eye. He tells the shop owner that he knows this building and that it's been blown up. The shopkeeper says yes, it was right outside the law courts. He also says that it was a church at one time, St. Clement's, to be in fact. The shopkeeper then begins a sort of rhyme saying, "Oranges and lemons, says the bells of St. Clement's." Winston asked him, "What is that?" And the old man responds, "It's a type of rhyme he used to say when he was a little boy, but he somehow forgot the rest of it." He then remembers, "Here comes a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a chopper to chop off your head." The old man says that it was a kind of rhyme, and there was a dance that went with it, and children would go under it, and their heads would be cut off. It was a little fun game. Winston was thinking about churches, and at what age these churches must have belonged to. He thinks that maybe it was during the period of the Middle Ages. He said that the centuries of capitalism were held to produce nothing of any value, and that one could not learn history from architecture any more than he could from books. Winston says that he never knew that it had been a church. The old man says there are a lot left, really, though they've been put to other use. And he then remembers another part of the rhyme. "Oranges and lemons, says the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 3 farthings, says the bells of St. Martin." The shop owner goes on to explain that a farthing was a type of copper coin, like a cent. Winston asks, "Where was St. Martin's?" And the shop owner says, "Oh, that one's actually still standing. It's in Victory Square alongside the picture gallery." He said it was a building with a kind of triangular porch and pillars in front and a big flight of steps. Winston knew exactly where he was talking about. but it was a museum used for propaganda displays of various kinds, from scale models of rocket bombs to floating fortresses, waxwork tableaus, illustrations, enemy atrocities, and all the like. Winston ends up not buying anything in this room, but staying in there a few more minutes just to kind of observe everything. He learns the name of the shop owner is Mr. Charrington, and that he's a 63-year-old widow, and he never really got around to changing the name on the shop on the front of the building. Winston also replays in his mind the small poem the shopkeeper had told him, and Winston almost thought he could hear the ringing of the bells inside of the small poem, though Winston had never heard the bells before. As he's making his way down the stairs and out of the shop, the song begins to play in his head, and Winston thinks that he's going to come back to the shop in about a month, and that he might actually buy the picture that was on the wall, rolled up into his overalls, and carry it home with him. While he was thinking all of this, he wasn't really paying attention to what was going on in his surroundings. So, when he steps outside, not too far away from him was the dark-haired woman from the ministry. At that moment, when he sees her, everything quickly freezes inside of his body, and his bowels turn to water. He can't move. She looks at him and then continues to walk away. At that moment, Winston knows without a doubt that she is spying on him and following him, due to the fact that no one in the party should have been at this part of the town or district, and on the same roads as him, or the same steps as him. He then begins to walk away, trying to come up with plans and alibis and different ideas of what he can do. At first, he thinks he might track her down, run after her, and bash her skull in with some sort of brick or stone. However, as stated, he knows he doesn't have the strength to do that. Then he thinks about possibly running to the community center as fast as possible to spend the last few hours until they close. That would give him a partial alibi. But then he knows he doesn't have the strength for that either. So he ends up making it back to his flat a little after 22 hours. He then goes to his desk, pulls out the diary, and stares at the cover of it. All the while, he's trying to tune out the hash voice on the telescreen that's singing some sort of patriotic song. Winston's mind starts to then think about acting in a fight or flight situation, one that is not really fighting an opponent, but rather than fighting themselves. Our bodies tend to freeze up, and we have to fight against that, or else we give in. He then opens the diary. He wanted to write something important in it for O'Brien, but then his mind wandered to the thought police and what would happen to him once they took him away, and that it wasn't a matter of if they killed you. To be killed was to be expected, but before death, there was the routine of confession that had to be gone through. The groveling on the floor and the screaming for mercy, the cracked bones, the smashed teeth, the blood clots of hair. He wondered why they had to endure it, since in the end, it was always the same. They were going to die. Was it not possible to cut a few days or weeks out of your life? He said that nobody ever escaped detection, and nobody ever failed to confess. He said that once you had succumbed to thought crime, it was certainty that by a day or two, you were to be dead. He tried a little more to summon up an image of O'Brien, and that's when he thought of what O'Brien said to him in his dream, which was, "We shall meet in a place where there is no dark." Winston knew what it meant, or at least thought he knew, that the place O'Brien was talking about was the future. The voice from the telescreen, however, unfortunately began nagging in his ears again, and he couldn't follow his train of thought any further. So he put a cigarette in his mouth, to which the tobacco promptly fell out of. He then slides a coin out of his pocket and looks at the face of Big Brother on it. It had a heavy, calm, protective feeling. But Winston couldn't figure out what kind of smile was hidden beneath the mustache of Big Brother. And at that moment, the words came back to him. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. This is where Part 1, Chapter 8 ends. Join us next time as we begin Part 2 of this series. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.